Notre Dame is a 2 to 5 player game by Stephan Feld, published by Rio Grande Games. Notre Dame is a game where players play heads of influential families in Paris and compete for reputation by influencing sectors in his borough and hiring special people to further their agendas, all while keeping the plague epidemic at bay. Notre Dame at its core is mainly a card drafting, action selection game with some minor elements of area influence and set collection at work. The rulebook is fairly straightforward, leaving very little to interpret. There is a column on the side of each page which summarizes everything and helps you remember the main rules when you're returning to play this game after some time. Notre Dame does come with a generic insert that you'll find from some other Rio Grande games of the same size, such as Macau. Each player will get a player board, which represents your borough and the different sectors you can influence. Perhaps the most innovative aspect is how each player board connects to assemble the central playing area, and it does so differently for different amounts of players, and each with a different central piece connecting the player boards. The central piece itself is a shared sector. Each sector represents an action that can be activated when it's influenced, and the more influence you have in a sector, the more powerful the action. One of these sectors is used to track the plague value for that particular borough, and is not associated with an action. Players start with 9 action cards of their color. Each card represents a different action you can take. Players also start with 4 cubes of their color, and these represent your influence which you will be placing in your boroughs. They'll also start with 3 coins. Players also have a trusted friend, which acts like a wild card when taking actions. Lastly, players have a carriage, and this is the only piece that can traverse other players' boroughs. Finally, there are also person cards available at the beginning of each round, which serve 2 main purposes. First, they tell you the plague value that will take place at the end of the round, represented by rats at the bottom of the cards. Second, after actions have been taken, person cards can be hired for a special action, either to obtain more resources, earn points, battle the plague, or maneuver cubes from one sector to another. There are a total of 9 rounds in which players will draft cards and take 2 actions each round, and optionally hire a person card at the end of each round for an additional but special action. The 9 rounds are broken into 3 periods each, A, B, and C, with each having 3 rounds. At the end of each period, there is some additional scoring and resetting of action cards. Each round consists of 5 fairly quick phases, with many phases done simultaneously for all players. Every round, 3 person cards will be laid out. This set is always comprised of 1 gray card and 2 brown cards. The 9 gray cards will only appear once in the game, and the period in which they will appear is indicated on the back. On the other hand, 2 of the 6 brown cards will accompany the lone gray card each round, and these brown cards will cycle again each period. Once these cards are laid out, players can start to strategize, knowing what people they can hire later, as well as what the plague value will be at the end of the round. Players will draw 3 cards of their color from the stack and decide which 1 card they will keep, and which 2 cards to pass to the player to their left. Players will then look at the 2 new cards they receive, choose an additional card, and pass the remaining card to the player to their left. Finally, you receive the 1 remaining card from the player to your right, and players will end up with 3 cards. In a game with more than 2 players, you will end up with 3 cards with 3 different colored backs, since they are from different players. In a 2-player game, the last card you receive is actually one of the 2 cards you pass to the opposing player. Of the 3 cards in your hand at that point, you will be able to play 2 of them, one at a time, in clockwise player order. Before I describe the actions, it is important to note that throughout the game, the more cubes you have on a sector, the more powerful that particular action will become when you take it, and this is represented by your influence cubes. If you choose to play the cloister school, you will place 1 cube from your personal supply onto the cloister sector. You then receive from the general supply as many influence markers as there are on the sector into your personal supply. If you choose to play the bank, you will place one cube from your supply onto the bank and then receive as many coins as you have influence markers on the bank sector. If you choose to play the residence, you will place one cube from your supply to the residence sector and take as many victory points as you have influence markers on the residence sector. If you choose to play the carriage house, you place one cube from your supply on the carriage house sector and are able to move your carriage up to as many intersections as you have influence markers in the carriage house sector. The more influence cubes you have, the more mobile your carriage becomes. You then get to take the message token at that spot. These tokens can give you points, coins, cubes, or help lower the plague value. You must collect a complement of one message in each color before you can collect another message of the same color, and you must do this for a second and third set, etc. If you choose to play the hotel, you can choose to take either one cube, one coin, or move the rat marker back one space. As soon as you have 4 influence markers on the hotel sector, you can choose 2 of the 3 options. If you choose to play the trusted friend, instead of placing an influence marker, you must play your trusted friend into a sector and execute the action associated with the sector. The presence of the trusted friend counts as an influence marker when determining the power of the action. The trusted friend is almost like a wild card, as he provides you some flexibility, especially if you are low on cubes. Wherever the trusted friend remains, he continues to act like an influence marker for the purposes of that action space. The 2 negatives is that the trusted friend must always be moved to a different sector whenever you play the trusted friend card, and it is usually better in the long term to place an actual influence cube in a sector, since its effects are more permanent compared to the transient nature of the trusted friend. If you play the park, you place a cube into the park sector and move the rat marker back one space only. However, for each 2 cubes you have in the park, you receive an additional victory point for each time you do anything in the game that earns you victory points. If you play the hospital card, you place a cube in the hospital sector and move the rat marker back one space. The amount of cubes in this sector does nothing further in this action phase. However, it will reduce the effect of the plague in the plague phase that I have yet to describe. The last action is the Notre Dame action. When this card is played, players will place one cube onto this sector and can pay 1, 2, or 3 coins to receive 1, 3, or 6 points respectively. This sector represents an area influence battle, since at the end of each period, players will be awarded additional points for having more influence markers here. The downside is that the cubes that are committed here are then returned to the general supply after each period and not given back to the player. If a player has no more cubes in his personal supply, when he plays an action card, he can choose to move one cube from another sector into a new sector matching the action on the card and executing that action. Keeping a good stock of cubes in your personal supply is fairly important. Since you only perform 2 of the 3 action cards in your hand, the third card is not revealed. What this does is add a bit of intrigue and hidden information to the game. It makes it so you can't perfectly calculate which cards have yet to be drawn, but you can still speculate. To hire a person, you spend 1 coin to execute the special action associated with that person. Players do this in clockwise order, and it is possible that a person card is hired by more than 1 player. Hiring is optional, but it is generally a good idea to hire a person when you can, since these special actions can be quite powerful. I won't go through all the cards, but I will describe a few to give you an idea. By hiring the Fool, the player moves any 1 influence cube from one sector to another and executes the corresponding action. By hiring the Doctor, the player reduces the plague value to 0 for himself for this round only. By hiring the Minstrel, the player may move 1 to 3 cubes from any one sector to another. By hiring the Mayor, the player will receive 3 victory points for each sector in his burrow with at least 3 influence cubes. When determining the plague value, the rat marker is moved up the number of spaces equal to the number of rats that appear on the person cards, minus the amount of cubes in the hospital sector. Everyone will do this individually, as everyone may have different amounts of cubes on their hospital. Whenever a player has his rat marker moved beyond the 9 space, the player loses 2 victory points, loses 1 influence cube from the sector that he has the most in his burrow, and his rat marker stays on the 9 spot. At the end of every period, the Notre Dame sector will be scored. A certain point value is assigned depending on the number of players. This pool of points is divided by the number of cubes in the sector and awarded to the owners of these cube colors. For example, in a 4-player game, 10 points are divided by 3 cubes, which is 3 points per cube, rounding down. Green would be awarded 6 points, while blue would be awarded 3 points. After scoring Notre Dame, the cubes are returned to the general supply. And since players have exhausted their draw pile of cards of their color, cards are returned to their owners. And this is done rather quickly, using the color on the backs. At the end of the 3rd period, the player with the most victory points wins the game. I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that this is the 2nd Stephan Feld game I purchased out of 5. This does not see the table nearly as much as Macau and Trajan, which are my favorites. Having said that, I still love this game, and am proud to own a piece of the genius that is Stephan Feld. Notre Dame and In the Year of the Dragon were games that turned me into a big Feld fan. Even though I prefer the heavier games, I wouldn't hesitate to play Notre Dame if someone asked. It has a place in my collection as a light Euro. People looking for a heavy game won't find that here, but I still think most gamers would appreciate the clever design and the streamlined gameplay. Even though there are a bunch of bits and cards, I don't find this game to be fiddly at all, and it plays very quickly, under an hour for 2 players, probably an hour for 3 and 4 players. I think players, if they wanted, could approach this game fairly casually, not really thinking too much, and just playing tactically with the cards you are dealt. On the other hand, you could play the mind game and try to figure out which cards are coming up. Playing either way, or a little bit of both, are enjoyable experiences. Playing 2-player does become a bit more of a chess match, because information is a little easier to track. As I mentioned earlier, the 3rd card you receive is one of the 2 you passed to your opponent that they passed you back. You get some good brain burn trying to figure out which one to keep, which 2 to pass, and guessing which one you think you'll get back. I think the game has decent variability, as the pile and order of action cards for you and your opponents is always different, shuffled at the beginning of the game and the end of each period. And the randomness of the person cards gives you different options to approach each round. There are also several different strategies to pursue. In addition, the expansion, which comes in the Elia treasure chest, provides 9 additional gray person cards, which can completely replace the original set or be mixed in with the originals as you choose. One negative about this game is the theme. At no point do you feel like what you're supposed to be. This is a Feld game, and you just get engrossed in the mechanics, since this isn't your typical cube pusher, as it may appear from the outlook. Another negative is the artwork. Some people have mentioned that the burrow boards look too busy, and I agree to an extent. The art looks a little bit bland, but I think how the player boards come together so beautifully and uniquely that I've kind of looked past the poor art. Overall, this is an excellent game. If you are a Feld fan or looking for a clever, light Euro, I recommend this one highly. Thanks a lot.